I'm going to begin, if it's okay, with a question, rather than coming at you with all of the answers and all of the information, as it would be a little arrogant of me to do that. And I'm going to come at you with a question that I've been asking to principals lately. So when I get around schools and the work that I do, I've been meeting lately with various principal groups. And rather than, again, tell them exactly what I think they should do, I ask them about their priorities. And the question that I've been using is that when all of this is over, we will have realised that this was the most important thing all along. So it's a very teachery thing to do, is to present what we call a close exercise. So it's a gap in a sentence, and to ask people what they think is the most important thing that we should have been focusing on all along. I actually think that if there's a teacher that's come along, a lesson that has come along for us this year, through the double hit that we've had in Victoria, in our schools and about school community and about working together. And I noted and actually wrote down what Stephen was saying when I came along today about whole school approaches to wellbeing and school climate and school culture. And I got me thinking a little bit again about this while I was sort of getting ready to speak to you today about this notion and what was it that's the most important thing. Now, for principals, they all like to know that it's not a test. There's not a right answer. There's not. We're going to get various opinions about what we will have realised was the most important thing all along. But I think this year has been a teacher. And it's been a teacher that perhaps we in schools and in school communities have found ourselves a little distracted by things that weren't important. And so what I want to bring you back to is, what do you reckon? What do you reckon is the most important thing? I'm keeping an eye on the chat box there. I can see some answers starting to come in. Go for it, get them in there. We've got relationships, we've got family engagement, human connection, relationships, connection, treating people as individuals. Thank you, Sarah, I appreciate that. Sustained connection, friendships, family support, relationships is bobbing up again. Connection, mental health and community. Yeah, these are all making a lot of sense to me. So thank you very much for that contribution. The good news for you is that your answers aren't different to the principals. So I think that while we have become, in schools at least, distracted by some stuff, the principals that I've spoken with have actually declared that they felt a little bit of guilt, a little bit of shame attached to the fact that the answers that they were providing that are very similar to yours, not answers that they feel they have been able to or perhaps choosing to prioritise as they move forward. And I put to them that if these answers that they're providing are kind of in the ballpark of where it is that we want to work and what it is that is our genuine priority, that the very best lesson that I have witnessed, and I've witnessed hundreds across 2020 in an online capacity in the schools that I work with. They've been fabulous, even about asking me to be able to come along and eavesdrop on some lessons that teachers have been running. And the very best lesson that I've seen was by a teacher in the Cranbourne area who introduced Clyde to her class. Clyde was her new puppy, and they had done some work around the house about trying to make sure that they were Clyde proof, that they were Clyde ready to get going. And the lesson that I witnessed was kind of came in two parts. So first of all, the teacher took her students by picking up her iPad that she was delivering to them, a Zoom type lesson with them on, and taking that iPad around her house and showing the students her home, introducing them to the people that are in their home. And then she walked into the backyard and she introduced them to Clyde. And she showed them some of the things that they had done to Clyde-proof their house. And the kids loved it. Group of about year 3 students they were. And then she showed them some of the, like I said, some of those improvements, some of those modifications they had to make sure that Clyde was safe and was not getting up to too much mischief. And she came back inside and then she introduced to the students what the creative writing lesson was that they would be doing the next day. And the creative writing lesson that they were going to do was going to be titled Clyde's Day. And it was all about what would happen if they left the gate open down the side of the house that she had just showed her students. What would Clyde's day have been like if he had gotten out that gate? And she said to me that it was the very best lesson, the very best learning, the very best product that the students had produced in the entire online experience they'd had. And for me, it was also, I believe, the best product, the best quality work that I'd seen students do while they were online. And I started to ask myself, what's that all about? You know, what was going on in that lesson that made the lesson work so well for her students? What protected them? What looked after them? What facilitated a fabulous result for those students? And I came back to it really being all about content and connection. And I've put it to several school leaders and teachers that when the first wave of COVID hit Victoria and most of our students went home and had to learn from home, I put it to them that we focused too heavily on the content. There was a fabulous reflective principal who I checked in on and said, you know, how are you going with being ready for online learning next week? And he said, I'm good. And I said, what do you mean you're good? You know, what have you done? And he said, we've got to the point now where we already know that in a few days' time, our students are going to be online and every single worksheet, every single resource they're going to need is already up on the platform and it's ready for them to download. And I said, yeah. And he said, you don't sound convinced. And I said, no. And he said, but they really are all online. And I said, I'm convinced about that. I said, I'm not convinced that your students are particularly interested. I'm not convinced that that's going to be useful to parents to just be able to download those worksheets and have them available. And like I said, fabulously reflective practitioner who had a moment where he went, oh dear. Yeah, we'd kind of missed the point. He needed to get back into this notion of how we connect. So what did this teacher do around Clyde? She leveraged connection so that the students were able to engage in the content. And I thought that even though it's just two spheres in a really simple Venn diagram, I thought that that was a brilliant piece of educative Machiavellian pedagogy. How do you, in the online environment, create an environment where kids want to do their best? One of the other things that I've spoken to a lot of teachers about recently is, and I've even had some opportunities where we've had, like today, hundreds of people online in one meeting. And so I can see all these tiny little thumbnails on the screen in front of me. And I've been able to ask people, put your hand up if you've had at least one student in your care who has unexpectedly thrived in online learning. And I can tell you now, every single teacher's hand goes up. And I've asked, what do you think that's about? And so it takes a bit of deep thinking, but I've got a bit of a theory around this now. So what I think it's about is the absence of shame and comparison for these students. So for some of our kids, when they're in the learning environment, when they're in the classroom, the teacher might be doing everything right. They might be trying so hard and saying to the student, you know what, I've been watching you for the last few minutes. And what you have done in trying to work your way through this really challenging problem that I put in front of you is so impressive. I'm proud of you. Well done. And what happens is that teacher turns and that student glows. But then he or she looks to the left and sees a student who did it better. And then looks to the right and sees a student who did it quicker. And then looks across the table to another student who's doing this at them. And all of a sudden they've convinced themselves that they are stupid again. They are in shame. And in shame, we don't do our best learning. It's a sad story, but I am thoroughly encouraged that when I put that story in front of teachers and say to them, your job now is to ask ourselves, when we get our students back, how would we reduce the shame associated with comparison that these students have been experiencing? And what they realise is that most of that comparison stuff starts to happen when we're over obsessed with content, and we're less obsessed, as we should be, with trying to get ourselves into a high level of connection where that praise, where that encouragement, where progress is something that we're collectively interested in. And I think that's a really exciting question for some of these teachers to start to answer. Then I asked myself, well, what's that really all about? What are we really talking about? And I reflected on the fact that when I do work with the partner schools that we work with all around Victoria and around Australia, one of the things that we do is we're really determined in our work that We won't work with a school who's not prepared to bring the parents on side in this whole pursuit of building a strong, sustainable relational culture for young people to be able to thrive in. We won't do it unless they'll work with the parents. So sometimes we get the odd school who'll say something to us like, oh, can we shave a bit of the cost off and leave the parent session out? And the answer is you probably need to find someone else to work with. And at those parent sessions, I'm often asking parents, what is it that you want the school to stand for? But then I say, just stop for a second, because I'm only going to give you two possible opportunities. I'm only going to give you two things that you can actually speak to, that you can answer when I say that you want the school to stand for this, because I'm going to put it to you shortly that we've been kind of tricked into thinking that there's much, much more. We've been tricked into thinking that, you know, it's about teaching the kids to swim, and it's about healthy eating at the canteen, and all those little things are things that exist in a school program. But I don't think parents send their kids to school for those things. And when I ask parents, why do you send your kids to school? Why do you let the most prized possession you have sit in the company of people that you haven't selectively chosen yourself for 6.5 hours every day? Why on earth would you do that? They tell me that there are two big things that they stand for. I wonder if this makes sense to you. So please feel free to make a comment. I am keeping a little eye on the chat box there, and I know that there are some comments that sometimes are more than a sentence or two or a couple of words. If I miss that, then forgive me, and I'll try to have a bit of a look at it later. And I think we've got a bit of Q&A time at the end here as well. And the two things that parents tend to come back to me and say are that, first of all, they want the school to be a house of learning. And so what I emphasize upon parents is that makes sense. We are, after all, educational institutions, that we should be interested in learning. And I put it to them that there are two parts to it. One is that we are constantly refining so that we can teach your children as much stuff as we possibly can that will be relevant, that will be useful to them. And then I put it to them again, just be careful around that though, about wishing too hard around that, because we don't know. You know, we have no real idea what students who are in prep or grade 1 this year are going to need to be successful in 12 or 13 years' time. So our curriculum guesses around what we're going to teach them, bit of a guess. But what we do know is that, and this is from projections that are even well outside the field of education, if you look at what even the World Economic Forum is telling us that young people are going to need when they to be successful in the future in the workforce, is they're going to need what sometimes sadly gets labelled as soft skills. They're going to need the ability to be able to collaborate with other people. They're going to need the ability to be able to solve problems with other people. So therefore to be able to cooperate around learning and about challenge. They're going to need the ability to be able to be empathic. They're going to need to be creative as well in order to solve some of the problems that we old people, unfortunately, are going to leave for them. So component one of the learning quest is to make sure that we teach them as much as we can that we think will be relevant. Component two is to make them great learners. We need to have your kids get to a point where they leave school with full capability and confidence to learn on the job. And so what we need to do is to take a focus on not only being able to learn and thereby being able to regurgitate some of that information on a test at the end of the year, or indeed at the end of their schooling, but how is it that we can have them land in a situation that might be challenging, but have them internally refer to self-talk that says, I'll be right, I've got this, I know how to learn, I'm good at this stuff. Now, the second thing that I really think this is all about, when I ask parents, what else do you want apart from the learning stuff, is that they refer to these soft skills. They want their young people, they often refer to things like social skills. And my catch-all banner for some of those soft skills, because like I said, I don't really like referring to it in that way. Somehow I think the term is giving people the idea that they're a little insignificant in some way, and they're not. What I refer to as my catch-all banner is citizen building. And I think that when we're talking about creativity, cooperative nous, empathy, resilience, responsibility, and respect, when we're talking about some of those things that young people need, I think that it goes back to a really simple notion. A lot has changed in schools, but this hasn't, I don't think, in the last maybe even 100 years. is that I think parents send their kids to school because they want their kids to learn as much as they can and become good learners, and they want the school to work with them to build their young person into a fantastic citizen, somebody who's capable of going out into the world and not only navigating it to be successful, but perhaps even making a really positive contribution to it as well. We're certainly going to need some of those as we move forward. So it's all about learning, it's all about teaching and learning, and it's all about citizen building. And so then I think we're entitled to ask ourselves, what went wrong? Why is it that there is so much inherent conflict between parents and schools? What are the factors at play that have changed over the last 20, 30, 40 years that have increased levels of conflict, particularly unproductive conflict, to the point where we're kind of in this adversarial relationship rather than this trusting relationship? When I ask parents and teachers all around the world, all around Australia, what do they think has changed the most in schools in the last 20 or 30 years? And I thank Sharon for her introduction around some of the work that we do around behaviour and wellbeing in schools and trying to get that conduct stuff elevated so that we're all conducting ourselves in a way that's productive for all rather than just for one. So I ask people all the time, what do you think's changed the most in schools in the last 30 years? And the answer that I get most common and that I can't argue with is that 30 years ago, if you got into trouble at school, you got into trouble twice. Now, I remember it. And by the way, it's not about the trouble. It's not about the trouble. It's about the trust that was inherent between home and school. I remember it because in year 3, back in the dying days of corporal punishment in schools, and by the way, not for a second am I advocating bringing in any of that stuff back, wholly destructive stuff. But back in those days, I remember my year 3 teacher, when she got a little emotional, mostly just a fabulous lady, but when she got a little emotional, she would lift the lid on the wooden desks and ask you to put your hands in the desk. And she would hover, she wouldn't slam, don't worry, just don't panic, there wasn't any broken fingers happen, but she would hover the lid just above your hands and ask you questions about why you were behaving a certain way. And if you answered correctly, she would say, that's right, now get back to it. And if you got it wrong, she would let go of the desk and you get a little bang on the hand. This happens to me once. And I went, Karen, I think she had that teacher too. I went home to tell my father what this evil person had done to me that day. And his response to me was, yeah, well, you would have done something. And my response to that was, what? Did you hear what I just said she did to me? And he said, yeah, I know you would have been up to something. And he turned on his heel and left the conversation. I was gobsmacked. And it took me until well into adulthood to work out what that was all about. And what it was about was that we were really clear on what we stood for. We stood for this notion of turning me into a great learner. We stood for this notion of working together to build me into a great citizen. And unfortunately, when we made some adjustments to the way we conducted ourselves, particularly even things like removing corporal punishment, kind of a no-brainer, unfortunately, we let the trust leave with us. How did that happen? How did we learn over a 30-year period to get into a point where we mistrusted each other at levels that we shouldn't, because it's not productive for our kids? And I put it to you that it's not parents' fault. I don't believe that en masse parents got together and said, you know what would help if we were looking to educate our kids better? If we just stopped trusting the school to do their job. I don't think it happened. And I don't think it was educators. I don't think educators got together and said, look, you know what, these parents are just in the way. If we could just get rid of them and just annoy them enough that they leave the scene and just let us do our job, then this would get done better. Nobody did that. Nobody came from this point of view. So how did it happen? My work over the last few years has convinced me that this is a media-led phenomena. So I think that it's media-led in that over that 30-year period, some of our tabloid style media that you see on the television in the morning really early and in the evening when we sit down for our dinner is going to send a message to our parents every week that they shouldn't trust schools. It's going to be in the form of, here's this crazy principal who banned handstands. Now, I don't mind if you think that handstands should happen at school or if they shouldn't, because it's not key to why you send your kids to school. But we've been invited into conflict over things that don't matter. And I tell teachers all the time, be careful, because they're nodding when I say, yes, that's right. The parents have learned not to trust us and they fight with us over little things. Be careful, because they're also sending messages into our teachers' lounge rooms that say, don't trust families. Look at these nuts that we found throwing rocks over the fence at 1:30 in the morning and paid a neighbour $1,500 for the footage of it. What they know is that the car crash phenomena, if we all slow down and provide our eyeballs when there's conflict and when there's disaster, works. They're not about to get to the point where they say, we're going to put a news story on tonight about how at Whittington Primary School, there's a fantastic community engagement officer who's doing incredibly important work gluing the community together. That rarely gets a run. So what do we do? What are we going to do about that? And what I think that we need to do is to put ourselves in a position where one school at a time is cognizant and brave enough to say, we've got a problem here about the way that we are connecting as parents and as educators, and that we're prepared to step beyond awareness. It's not just about being aware of the problem anymore. In the same way that I get really frustrated with some of our schools and the ways that we work together around bullying. And it's sad, because sometimes when it comes to bullying, the output, the results of bullying is disastrous. Sometimes, and we've all seen stories in the media of young people who've ended up even taking their lives as a result of the awful, insidious effects of bullying. And I get frustrated that every time that happens and somebody spawns a new foundation around that so much of it seems to be around building awareness. When I speak to schools everywhere, sorry, I think you're telling me to get my questions ready, Gail, but I've got that now. When I speak to schools everywhere and ask teachers and parents, are you aware that we have an issue with bullying in our schools? They all put their hand up. And so I ask these two questions. So what? Now what? What are you going to do about that? What changes as a result of our awareness? Being aware that our relationship has been put in peril by people who don't care about it is one thing. But then saying, so what? Now what? And how do we push back on that? How I believe we push back on that is one school at a time who's prepared to be brave enough to answer those questions. Be brave enough to get deep and to get serious about what is the culture that we are building around our school. And this is what indeed I founded Real Schools on, is this notion that what we need to do to find a next threshold, a next level in our ability to have our schools cater for who our young people really are, is to answer this question about what sort of culture we want. I ask schools all the time, put your hand up if you ask teachers, roomfuls, put your hand up if you think that the culture of your school is important, and every hand goes up. And then I ask them again, could you just keep those hands up for a moment, because I'm going to invite one of you, I'm going to actually enlist one of you to come out the front and tell everyone what the connected definition of school culture is. And a lot of hands go down. I often make the joke, we turn into kind of, the lawyer from the great Australian movie, The Castle, Dennis Denuto, not the photocopier scene, but the scene where he's asked to describe the Constitution. And we say, so the culture, it's, it's the vibe, it's the atmosphere, it's Marbo, it's all of these things. We're not sure. And I point out to everybody, how is it that we can have roomfuls of educators who say that they believe the culture of their school is incredibly important, and then have no idea what it is? How do we work on it if we haven't worked out what it is? And so we talk about the fact that culture for me is a behavioural set. It's a big ball of behaviours that are distributed or contributed by all of the key stakeholders in a school. So it's our three key stakeholder groups are our parent and carers, our staff, and our students. And every time they contribute a behaviour, that's part of what our culture is. Within that big ball, there are what I call referred to as being two subsets. So there are the behaviours we encourage, that we say, that's awesome. Love that behaviour. That behaviour belongs at our school. Do it again. That's what makes a young person responsible. Go nuts. And then there are behaviours that we tolerate. So behaviours that exist in our school, but we'd rather they didn't. And schools that have great cultures are not necessarily the schools that have none or even a small amount of tolerable behaviours. Let's be honest. Schools should be places where the behaviours are a bit weird. We've built these institutions for several hundred young people whose brains aren't finished yet. Then we decided to get them to interact with the people who have the most irrational, illogical, emotional connections to them. Some of you people. And our staff who create these attachments to young people who have no capacity to be consistent in the way that they work. We're going to have emotional days. We're going to have days where in emotion we make the wrong choices. It's all right. Schools that have a strong culture are the ones that say we've got a methodology for being able to move the behaviours one at a time from the tolerate pile to the encourage pile. And we often encourage schools to use the restorative methodology to do that. The picture that you can see on the screen here is of my last day job, if I may put it that way, when I was a principal of a fabulous new school in the Northern Territory called Rosebery Primary School, where we had 350 kids come together on day one. And they were from 36 different schools on the previous day that they had been to school. I had 36 staff members there on day one who came from 35 different schools. Getting them on the same page was going to be an enormous challenge. We had taken up the challenge of saying, new school, let's not be encumbered by the past and by tradition and by habit. Let's only do things in our brave, innovative new school that genuinely help our kids in terms of learning and in terms of being developed into great citizens. Let's only do things like that. Every little detail we can change if we want to, if we're brave enough to. And so I stood in front of that assembly. This is a photo I took just before I was about to commence the very first assembly at this new school. And I found myself going, okay, change everything. You know, if you think it can help, change everything. And I was about to deliver the exact same primary school principal good morning that every primary school principal has delivered in Australia for a couple of hundred years. You know the one. But whenever a primary school principal says good morning, you are to present your eyebrows, you are to lower your voice, and in the most somber tone you can muster, you are to say, good morning, Mr. Voigt. And I just went, I just don't know that this is the most important thing. You know, I just don't know that this is the greatest way to open a brand new school. And so I stood in front of them and I said, good morning, everyone. But before you say good morning, you'll notice many things that are different around our school. For instance, we were a co-teaching school, not one single classroom in that school. Every learning environment was two teachers working in cooperation with approximately 50 students. We were a school that co-located with a middle school that came with its own unique challenges. We were a cooperative learning school implementing an approach called Kagan Cooperative Learning. We were a restorative practices school. We said, don't expect standard cookie cutter crime and punishment type approaches from us. We teach our kids to take responsibility by encouraging them to do it, but cleaning up the mess when they make a mistake. It's all right. We help them so that we can then thank and congratulate them for getting that right. So there were many things that were different about our school, and I spoke to someone, I said, including the way that we say good morning. And the back of my head is speaking to the front of my brain saying, you still don't know how you're going to say good morning. And so this is what I came up with. I said to them, we're going to say good morning with excitement and enthusiasm, because that's how I feel about opening your brand new school. And I still didn't know what I was going to say. So what I came up with was, I'm going to say good morning, everyone, with excitement and enthusiasm, and then I'm going to clap twice. That was it. That was the best I could come up with under pressure at the time. And all you need to do, everyone, for me is to say good morning, Mr. Voigt, back to me with the same excitement and enthusiasm, and clap twice. And so I said, good morning, everyone. And all of the students echoed back to me, good morning, Mr. Voigt. Even the little ones you can see there, preschool being part of the Northern Territory's primary school program. Those kids down the front of that photo, barely 4 years of age, and they got this right second go. You know, they were amazing. And I thought that when I left the school, that and I stayed in Darwin for another year while I founded Real Schools. And Darwin's a small place, so you're bumping into people that you know and that you have got, been working with for a really long time. In at roundabouts and at sporting events and in car parks. And I thought they would come and speak to me about the wonderful work we did at our school. And we did. The biggest risk that you can take academically with your child's progress is to change schools. The research tells us that being the new kid induces a period of great limbic and nervous response, where the kids sometimes struggle to make academic progress in the first sort of 3 or 4 months that they're in that new environment. We had 350 new kids, and our kids' results were very much mirrored in the progress rates that other schools were achieving. I'm really proud of that. And I thought some people would notice the way we pulled together some of those approaches around co-teaching and restorative practices and cooperative learning and evidence-based programming and planning that our teachers were doing. And yet no one came and thanked me for those things. All I had was people sneaking up behind me in the freezer section of the supermarket and saying, "Morning, Mr. Boyd." And it struck me then what I'm really talking about when I'm talking about culture. And it's the little things. We have over-formalized too many of the big things that we want to do in schools. And when it comes to improving the behaviour and the conduct that comprises our culture, we do things like buy programs that we teach on a Wednesday afternoon. We buy resources and online stuff that we put our students or our staff members through. We put posters on walls. But unless we can stop and ask ourselves, how do 2 students behave themselves when they walk away from our school? And when I see them cross the road, when I see them meander down a path through a park and they walk away from the school and no one's watching them, have I impacted that conduct because of the environment because of the culture that I have immersed them in every single day? It's the little things that we choose to ritualize, habitualize, and make the absolute routine of the way that we work every single day that create our culture. And unless we are prepared as a school to get back to the point where we can, where we're prepared to impact all of those little interactions, because nearly every interaction that we have in a school is informal, and therefore doing formal things about it all the time doesn't quite get us there. I want to give you one little tip, one little strategy that we use when we're working with our teachers and our parents, and that is to use what we call affective language, which is really just say what you were going to say, but chuck in a feelings word. And people look at me and go, "What do you mean?" I said, if a student drops a piece of rubbish in your school, I used to have the same default that everyone else had, which is usually, "Hey, pick that up." I've had to work on it. I've had to change it. But, and it's taken real effort and practice, but eventually what I've got myself is to a point where I don't even think about saying, "Hey, pick that up." What I do is say to them, "Disappoints me to see you do that, pop it in the bin." Still a statement. It cost me about 1 second more. I'm not stopping and I'm not intervening. I'm intervening too much. I'm not putting an entry in a database. I'm not getting out a series of question cards that they have to work their way through. But what the word is that I guess you will have probably heard me say most loudly is the word disappointed. And this word teaches our kid. One, it slightly increases the likelihood that they'll pick up the piece of paper. There's no guarantees. There's no guarantees in anything when it comes to conduct and behaviour. But it slightly increases the likelihood that they will pick up that piece of paper, because at the moment I go, what? How can this have something to do with you? And we're all hardwired to want to be in the company of people who want to be in our company. So it's kind of why resist. The second thing it does is that it enacts the most important protective factor against bullying and being able to navigate a social system, and it's empathy. You can't teach empathy formally. You can't run a mini lesson on a Wednesday afternoon. In fact, most of us, probably even if we think we were helped to be empathic by our families, won't remember the night that mum and dad sat us down and gave us the empathy talk and put the empathy PowerPoint on. The way you learn empathy is to be trapped in a relational system, a school community or a home environment or a neighbourhood that kind of reminds you with outrageous regularity through its language that it matters. When I speak to teachers and say, "It sounds so insignificant, doesn't it? Sounds like you couldn't possibly make a big difference in the way that you grow kids with just that tiny little word thrown in." And I ask them, "How many opportunities do you have a day?" And teachers often say 100. You know, "Well, I'll be kind. What if you caught 50? And what if you had 40 colleagues in your school? Because that's 2,000 opportunities a day that a young person gets a direct lesson around empathy from a grown-up in the school and everybody else who hears it. That's 10,000 a week. That's 100,000 a term. That's 400,000 lessons a year. Now you tell me that stacks up again, that doesn't stack up against a mini lesson once a semester around empathy. And I think we're kidding ourselves. The biggest impactor on a culture is our language. And if as educators, we're brave enough to say, so what about some of the problems that we're facing, now what? And if we're brave enough to say, I'm prepared to change even the way I speak, to do that in my school, some incredibly powerful stuff starts to happen. That powerful stuff can, I guess, add up to sometimes some incredibly powerful stories. And the story that I want to finish my presentation today with came from a Victorian student who's had a really interesting last couple of weeks. You can see her in that top right picture there. Hayley, her name's Hayley Ross, and she's with her fiance there, Kyle. And Kyle, Hayley is a student who I taught for 2 years in a school called Sky Primary School down on the top of the Mornington Peninsula. And Hayley went through a difficulty that many teachers help their students through, and that is that her folks split. So dad left the family and mum was heartbroken, and not only heartbroken, but suddenly a single parent. And I thought that if you were going to make a poster about who was the bravest, the strongest single parent that you could find, it would have Bronwyn Ross on it. She was so plugged in. She was at the school all the time, checking in on how her girls were going, involved in school council, doing so many things right. I thought that she was made of steel, but she wasn't. And she was starting to battle a little bit. And luckily, while I was oblivious to it, her own mother, so Hayley and her sister Tegan's grandmother, did notice. And she said, you need a break. And so she said, what I've done is I've arranged to have the girls stay with me for a week. And I've bought you and your friend Marilyn plane tickets, and you're going to go and sit on the beach. You're going to drink margaritas. You're going to get a suntan. You're going to have a great time. And when you get back, there'll only be about 8 weeks left until Christmas, and we'll give you another break then. And, we're going to look after you, which was just a beautiful and a kind thing to do. And Bronwyn and her friend Marilyn were in Sari Club a little over 18 years ago when it was bombed by terrorists in Bali. The news came on a Sunday morning, and I got up and saw the old Channel 9 Sunday program on, and had a bit of an argument between my head and my gut, where my head said, lots of Australians in Bali, I'm sure she's fine. And my gut said, this is not good. And this time my gut was right. 24 hours passed and we had no word from Bronwyn, which could only mean one thing. Arrived at school the next morning, and as I got out of the car, a well-meaning assistant principal approached me, and I asked her the only question I could think of, which was, what do I do? What do I do? And she said, I've been thinking about it too, Adam. And she said, I want the school to be the rock for these kids. You see, every kid in my class had slept in Bronwyn's house. Bronwyn used to have sleepovers on a Friday night sometimes for the school, for our class. And she would insist that Hayley invite 12 kids along, 6 boys and 6 girls. The girls would sleep down the back of the house. The boys would sleep down the front. Bronwyn would sleep in the hallway, so that never the twain shall meet in the night. And then the next sleepover she ran, she would insist to Hayley that she invited the 12 kids who didn't come the first time around. That's how plugged in she was to our environment. That's how much my entire class was going to be affected by the news that was coming that day. And she, and this assistant principal said, so I want school to be the rock. I want the school to be the thing that's not upside down for these students. And she said, so for now, Adam, I want you to be business as usual. I want you to be the rock, steady, nothing's changed for us. I went, right. And I walked away. And it was the very first time in my whole entire educational career that I led no. These are students who are going to come that day in need of connection, who are going to come in need of support, and who are going to come in need of love. something that we don't talk about as being an education and an educational outcome anywhere near enough. And through the wonderful help of an assistant teacher called Trish, who I'm just grateful to to this day, we didn't do that. We sat the kids in a circle and we started to talk about what had gone wrong, so that for a group level, we had a way of finding out where they were at and giving support. We had an individual support approach too, which was a tap on the shoulder. One tap meant I'm going outside for 5 minutes. 2 taps meant, Mr. Voigt, I'm going outside, please follow me. 3 taps meant, Mr. Voigt, I'm going outside, could you please follow me in 5 minutes? And Trish and I had a lot of taps on the shoulder over the next few weeks. About 2 weeks later, the day came that I knew was coming, when a girl in my class called Jessica met me at my car as I was arrived in the morning, and she said, Mr. Voigt, Hayley's back. And I said, right. And I threw her my keys and I said, let yourself and Hayley into the little office next to our classroom. I'll be there in a minute. And I took a big deep breath and walked into that classroom, walked into that office and faced the most vivid moment that I've ever had as an educator. Was looking down at that 11-year-old girl who looked up at me and she said, Mr. Voigt, my mum's dead. And I said, I know. And I gave her a cuddle. All I could think of. I had no words. Still find it hard to talk about sometimes. And we put in place some of those systems to try and help her through over the next couple of weeks. Sent her off to high school. She was in grade 6. You know, hope for the best. About 4 years ago now, I got a Facebook request from a Hayley Ross. And I went, oh, I don't like doing the former student thing. You know, then I did a quick mental calculation in my head of how old she would be now. And I thought, oh, I really am getting old, aren't I? And out of absolute curiosity, and I'm sorry for the people in editing, I do apologise for that. I'm hoping that Hayley leaves an impression upon you, but out of curiosity, I accepted, and she struck up a conversation with me. And she said that she started to tell me a story, and I started to ask my story about my memories as well at that time. And I said, could you do me a favour? I said, so when I tell, well, first of all, I asked permission to tell her story. So please know that you hear Hayley's story today with her permission. And she said, secondly, I said, could you make sure I don't get it wrong? And so I said, could you write me your story? You know? And so she wrote me a letter and she sent it to me with the photos that you can see on the screen. So what you can see there is, like I said, Hayley and Kyle. You can see Bronwyn in the middle there, at the age she was when she lost, when we lost her. Hayley and Tegan, you can see at the bottom there at the ages they were when they lost their mum. You can see a picture up the top there of Hayley and Tegan and Kyle, who went back to Bali, not to mourn, but to celebrate Bronwyn's life. I'm a little worried about Hayley and Kyle because, you know, Kyle was also a year 5-6 boy in that class. So I'm a little bit suspicious of those sleepovers now. And the 2 pictures you can see at either side there at the bottom, one is a picture collage that one of our students, Lauren, had put together. And she had tricked, this is back in the day where if you wanted to print in colour in a primary school, you had to sort of pay with a limb. So Lauren tricked me into borrowing a digital camera and tricked me into printing it in colour so that she could make this collage board, this signature board where everyone had written a message to Hayley, and then she delivered it to her just a few days after she'd lost her mum. And the signature teddy bear, I wonder if you remember those, was brought in by my kind of big burly ruckman Regan, who said, who brought this in and said to us that we all had to sign it. I'm not completely convinced that Regan didn't say to a couple of students, sign this or I'll bash you, but sign it we all did. In our morning circle, one of the students said to Regan the next morning, because he rode that bear to Hayley's house 11 kilometres the night before to deliver it to her. And one of the students said to Regan, what'd you do that for? And he said she'd lost her favourite thing to cuddle. She needed a replacement. And Hayley's kept all of this. In her letter, she said to me that she became thoroughly determined not to let down the students, not to let down that group that looked after her at that time. She said that class to me was not a classroom. It was a lounge room. It was where she felt home. and that the 2 weeks that she wasn't allowed to come and see us were part of the hardest part of losing her mum. I want to point out to her family did that out of only love and support. There's no absolutely zero criticism there of what they were doing. She said it was hard to be away from the people who cared for her so much at that point. She said, I became determined not to let those people down by being the teenager, in her words, forgive me here, who slips into drugs, alcohol and prostitution because something awful happened to me. She said, I'm not going to be defined by death. She said, I will get passionate about new life coming into the world, not life going out of it. And when I found out that when she finished her high school days, she went and did some training after school, some tertiary education, and became a midwife, and has been spending some of her adult life bringing new lives into the world every single day. She had to stop because not only was last week the 18th anniversary of losing her mum, but it was also a very special day on Friday when she brought her second little life into the world of hers and Kyle's own, and little Ollie was born last week. And I'm wrapped, and was just delighted to be able to send her a message. I'm proud of her, and I'm proud of the difference that the classroom that I facilitated made in being able to give her a chance, to being able to put Hayley's life on a slightly more positive life trajectory. And we forget this in schools too often. We forget that even though we're only moving them a little bit, that we forget that graph continues over time. When they're out of sight, they're no longer with us. They continue to grow. And if we can bring that content and connection piece back, and say that's what we need to work on, if we can bring back the notion that we need to focus on great learners and great citizens, then we can do some fantastic stuff. Now, I'm going to provide you in just a moment with an email address. And if you send an email today to that address and ask for the slide deck here, then I'm really happy to send that to you. And the only thing I'm asking in return is that you show it to your local school and go with Gail's advice, which was always remember that there's always nice ways to approach the school. So don't go to them, if you would forgive me giving you some advice here, don't go with accusation about not getting their communications right, because this is the boring bit. I should finish with Hayley's story and be on a big emotional bang, but the most important bit is boring here. And it's about how we can get our schools back into healthy communication with our parent community. And I speak to this model regularly, and I'm so proud of some of the schools and the work they've done enacting this model, that if we can get our message right, it's kind of like lighting a fire. You need 3 elements. You need oxygen, heat, and fuel. And if we can get our message right, we get the oxygen in place. And the message has always got to be around teaching and learning and about citizen building. Forget the prices at the canteen, forget handstands, forget swimming lessons, forget sending teachers newsletters that have principals report, because gee, I don't know about you, I've never read a newsletter that starts with principals report and thought, now I feel like reading on. Get your message right as a school. Speak to parents about the reasons that they send their kids to school. Get the channels right. Stop believing that it's because we put it on a newsletter and it ended up at the bottom of a bag under a smashed banana that somebody read it. Be where parents are. Be in that social space. Don't let it be a space that defines your school as a place to criticise. And then get your volume right, which means talk about it all the time. Make it who we are. Make this our expertise. We all love to trust experts. And if we want trust back in the relationship between home and school, then what we have to do is to reposition our educators as experts. And we want them to be experts around teaching and learning and around citizen building. We all love to trust an expert. You think about a doctor's surgery. If you go to a doctor's surgery, they actually deliberately make you wait so that you think that person's important. And then they put you in a room for a couple of moments before the doctor arrives in the suite where you get to see all their qualifications on the wall. There is design here around you being reminded before you listen that this person's an expert. And as teachers, what we need to do, the imperative upon us, is not to badger parents about when library books are due back and what the fines will be for not doing that, but it's to speak to our expertise. I see teachers do, and I see school leaders do some incredible work that is unnoticed. And I think that it's a terrible disservice to our parents to not share that with them. So this model for me is not something that I want your teachers to, school leaders to think about and to get into shame around, because you need all three. You really do, because if you're absent of the message, then you're untrustworthy. Why would you trust someone who won't even speak about what they're supposed to be qualified and expert at? If you're absent of the volume, then you're unconvincing because you just don't say it enough. And if you're not putting it where parents are, then it's not very interesting. We don't want to engage in it because we're following those traditions. So there's risk attached to this model, but there's just some awesome opportunities to do some really good work. Hey, if this is of interest to you, then I'm just going to really quickly give you one little really just tacky salesy opportunity here. And that is that I've written a book on this called Restoring Teaching. And if you head to that website there, then you'll be able to grab yourself a copy. This slide's staying on no longer because I didn't come here to sell you things today, but I hope that the book will be something, if you'd like to, that you can learn a lot more, because this is about probably my presentation today is probably three pages of what that book's all about, and I hope that it can be useful to you, and you can feel very free to re-gift that. And if you would like to get in touch with the slide deck from today, then please, the email address there, info@realschools.com's there. Feel free to have a bit of a snoop around realschools.com.au and give us a call if there's anything that we can do to give you a hand. I know that I've seen through the corner of my eye that there are some questions. So I think, Gail, you're going to help me to make sure that I answer the ones that you think are the ones that I should get my head into straight away.
Certainly.
Thank you very much.
Okay, can you hear me, Adam?
I've got you, Gail, yes.
Yeah, beautiful. Okay, so the first question, Liz, is from Liz, and she asks, is it going to be different post the pandemic, the parent-school relationship culture? What's your view on that?
Yeah, my view on that is that we don't have long. So because when it comes to culture and context, we're all really heavily influenced by context. So what I mean by that is that we behave a certain way when we go to a certain place. So when we arrive at a rock concert, we're conditioned to behave a certain way. We don't think about it, we just condition. When we arrive at a place of worship, we behave completely differently, or in a library. So I think that I think the biggest risk we face around the parent and school relationship is business as usual. Is that if everything looks exactly the same, then we'll kind of probably behave the same way. But if schools can be a little wise here and realise that parents have this year, particularly Victorian parents, had an opportunity to peek behind the curtain. I kind of got a little look at what it's like to be a teacher, and we saw lots of memes and posts online about how, oh my goodness, I'm going to be buying my child's teacher an extra expensive present this year, or am I allowed to drink wine at 9:30 in the morning? I can't believe how hard it is to be a teacher. If schools can say, while parents remember that we've got an opportunity to say, well, let's do this really important work together. Let's forget some of the superfluous stuff that a current affair has convinced us to argue about. And let's say it's all about teaching and learning now. It's all about turning our kids into great citizens. If we have conflict, let's work through that together, because of course we're going to get that. And let's get back to why parents send their kids to school, because they're the kind of the same reasons that will make them successful after school as well. So I think we've got a short window. If we can seize it, then we can do some really cool stuff.
That leads into Nicole's question. She was saying, as parents, we want to be involved, but there seems to be a range of hurdles to do so. Any suggestion, Adam, from your conversations with school leaders and teachers, how we could do that more effectively together?
Yeah, I do have suggestions around that. One is that I think that you're right. I think there are hurdles in the way, and they're hurdles that have been put there by fear. So schools are that frightened of doing something different because they'll end up on a current affair, or they'll get complained about, or there'll be a bad post about them on social media, that they kind of keep playing it safe, and they don't step into that absolute expertise. We're just doing what people expect. And it's because we haven't provided adequate points of reference for our families. So because we're filling our assemblies and our our newsletters with sort of boring information that does, operationals and management type stuff, that we haven't got that trust in place to do something that's a little bit different or unexpected, because we don't sit down then and talk about it. We're just worried about the complaints that will come from it. So when I tell schools, for instance, I gave that example before about working restoratively and how it's not about a set and agreed set of, this is the crime, this is the punishment, because we're trying to be consistent. You can't do that. It never works. Because behaviour, hates to be sort of caged that way. There's all different types of behaviour. You can describe, pushing, but there's pushing and then there's pushing, And so when we try to change that, and so we're not going to have that, people go, oh, well, hang on, that's not the way the world works. So, stop, communicate properly why you want to do something and how you're going to do it, and give parents the opportunity to be a part of understanding that, and they'll argue less. And then if we've got less argument and conflict, schools will stop putting barriers in the way of parents getting involved. The best example I've seen of it was across COVID, was a principal who ran a weekly online town hall session.
Wow.
Where she just said, no agenda, but she opened Zoom, sent the link out and said, if you're wondering what's going on, come and ask me a question. And I'll tell you to the best, and I'll give you the best explanation I possibly can. That's it.
Yep.
So I think that way parents know, and we they know why you're doing what you're doing, and I think that's powerful.
And the last question would be, because I'm just mindful of the time, and you've been generous with your time, so much appreciated, is that, and this one's a little bit about expectations of schools, or, well, not really schools, really, probably governments. How can we encourage our kids to become lifelong learners, not just to the prep to, foundation year to year 12, and actually get schools to see it's not about just grades and ATAR and success to go to university?
Yeah, so big question there, I guess. If I was to provide you with the sneakiest possible answer around it, is that if we have parents who want their kids to be great learners and great citizens, and we have schools who want to be in that game, who want exactly the same thing, then my suggestion has been to a few schools that have said, well, how do we get this? We've had some schools come through and work with us in regions, in groups, together. So like maybe a senior high school with 5 or 6 feeder schools who've come through and work a different way together. And what we do is we do fabulous work, and then we let the local member take absolute credit for it. So in terms of finding a way for governments to change, it's not going to change. This may be an inconvenient truth, but it's not going to change until it's popular. And how do we make it popular? We let local members take credit for the wonderful work that we do. So instead of waiting, because the populism stuff, that governments kind of tell us all the time that we need to do this, and they say, back to basics is a great example. Back to basics doesn't mean anything, and what it means is I'm just giving you a familiar point of reference, your own school experience. But if we say we want to do things differently, is to let everyone share the successes of that, and thereby make that success popular. So it's a bit of I think we've got a great opportunity for a grassroots revolution in Australia. It won't come from the top. It'll come from us.
And last sneaky one, how do we ensure the conversations continue after all the inquiries post the pandemic?
How do I make sure the conversation can you give me a little bit more on that, Gail?
Yeah, sure, because we've been, and Parents Victoria and many others, parents themselves, there'll be parents in the Zoom room now that have given feedback to their individual school, but we as an organisation, all the stakeholders have given information back to government, federal and state. And so we don't want that conversation to close. We want that to continue. So we will be aiming that people like yourself, Adam, and everyone in the space will keep those conversations going. Yeah. So just your last remarks on that, and then I'll hand back to Sharon.
No worries. To be really broad about this, I'm not very specific. I opt out of conversations where it feels like people are accusing me of stuff. So I think that I tell teachers all the time, when you have a student on the yard who's doing the wrong thing, I said, approach them with curiosity, not accusation. And so I think that if parents are able to take that view, that I'm going to approach my school with curiosity. So instead of coming in saying, what'd you do that for? Is come in and say, what'd you do that for? Then I think that allows us a better quality conversation to happen. So I think approaching it with curiosity, not accusation, would be, I think, a way to keep this conversation going.
Thanks, Adam.
Pleasure. Thank you for having me.